This will be the last of the lectures here on campus. I'll give my last for the whole of it tomorrow morning at Shilai Temple. Jane said that I've taken you on quite a trip. This is going to be an even broader trip one way. I'm going to start with the Ice Age.
Oh.
You never know where I'm going to start. For a long time, I've been thinking about some of the issues which I'm going to discuss tonight. And part of what I'm looking at is, I once gave a lecture about Buddhism in the ruins. Buddhism has a lot of ruins, archaeological ruins. Buddhism has an enormous amount of this. And yet we never really try to explore what those ruins mean. We try to look to some degree at it, but I've been trying to think about what is it that brings about development, and then what is it that sustains the development, and what is it that ends it? Because in many places Buddhism comes to an end. Other places it thrives. So I've been trying to understand what is it that we're dealing with. So I'll start with the Ice Age. Because even a physical thing like ice is a system. And the Ice Age created certain situations which we have to understand in order to understand the human history. And when the system stops and the ice melts, then the things which were true during the Ice Age are no longer true. Other things become true. I've always loved Stonehenge in England. When I was in college, I lived in England for a year, and I lived near Stonehenge. I used to go there. It used to be that it was just out in an open field. You could walk there and walk in it, and nobody made any fuss about it. Now it's controlled. What I had not been aware of when I used to do that was the Ice Age. Well, if you look at the map, you'll see where Stonehenge is, and you'll see where the ice sheet that covered England is. In other words, what we're looking at when we look at this structure is we're looking at a civilization that moved into this island as the ice began to recede. And that the greatest and the great power of the new civilization that occupied Great Britain after the ice melted would be able to create something as great as Stonehenge. They would transport these stones more than 100 miles. And they would build this enormous structure, which was a religious structure, and we're still trying to fully understand it. But it was the systems that change and allow such things to occur. Or, still staying in England, if you look at DNA studies, the DNA studies represent systems that have existed that we have no other way to track. In other words, if you look at the DNA for the British Isles, it changes dramatically from Scotland to southern England to Wales. It's not a single system by any means. It's a multiple system. And so the DNA allows us to track how a system came in. It may have disappeared entirely as in terms of any other aspect, but the echo of the system is still in our DNA. So I'm just using these as examples to get you into systems. Buddhism in the ruins. If you go to Central Asia, you can go for miles and miles past hundreds of ruins, big ruins, cities, some of them square miles of cities. And today, nothing. Rammed earth, because it's dry, they're still there. Many of them have never been archaeologically dug. We have no idea what is under the ground in all of these places. So when I go along this so-called Silk Road and I look at all these ruins, then I ask myself the question, what happened here? What happened? What systems built this huge network of cities out here in the middle of nowhere? And then what happened that the system couldn't sustain them? And they've all gone to ruins. It seems to me that in terms of what we're looking at here, in order for a city to remain, it has to have a reason and it has to have the economics. As long as there was a lot of trade coming up from the west coast of India through the Indus Valley and across the Taklamakan into China, as long as that system was in operation, there was money, there was need for cities along the way. But these were special cities. They did not really produce anything. They were not centers of production. They were transfer points. They were business centers. That's all they were there for. They were there to sustain a particular system, which was trade. Once that system began to break down, the Roman Empire had fallen, trade had fallen off in the Indian Ocean, the Han Dynasty had fallen, all of the things which sustained a system of trade through the Central Asia was gone. Once that system ceased to be profitable, there was no need for these cities. So I feel as if when I go into Inner Asia and drive by all of these ruins, what I'm seeing is the remains of a system which was once vital, really had a lot of money. You look at some of the great things which they built, the Donghong Caves, for example, 400 caves, richly decorated, enormous amount of money put into just a place out there in the middle of the desert, built on this system. So our systems are extremely important, and we don't always understand that. We are all part of systems. All of us exist and thrive or not according to certain systemic developments that surround us. And if that system which supports us begins to fail, then you've got to make a quick choice. How do you sustain yourself if the system isn't there? Can you adapt? Well, if we watch systems undergoing, I like to look at, for example, if I go to Gandhara region, the famous Buddha statues at Bamiyan. The system which built them, which was the Buddhist system of the Kushan era, those huge Buddha images which were carved out of the rock and were very stable, therefore. But when the system of the Buddhist merchants and everything failed and another system went into place, then they began to fall into disarray. But when then another system arose, which was the Taliban, then the Taliban system not only neglected, but they purposefully destroyed. So a system, when you have a real switch in the system, can suddenly become destructive in the sense of tearing down the thing which has been built. The other thing I like in the Gandhara region, of course, is that we see a system which tied it to Greece. The Greeks were there. And here we have a picture of the Trojan Horse. The story about the Trojan Horse, the trick of putting soldiers inside a horse and rolling this big horse inside the city and then conquering the city. That story had reached into Central Asia, and they made pictures of it. Part of a system which tied them all the way back to the Greek Empire in the Mediterranean. When that was broken, these things just became archaeological finds. They became ruins. But we are constantly beset with these. So when the Taliban came to Bamiyan and they destroyed it, what we're seeing is a system beginning to operate against what was once another kind of system. This is a negative system in that sense. They said, we don't like images, we want to purify our land, we're going to get rid of this image. We don't want it. And that's all right. And so they blew it up. That's systemic to me. In other words, what I'm trying to see is, how do we explain that this happens? And it happens so often. And it happens in many, many places. And it has particularly happened in Buddhist history. And this is one of the examples that we've seen in our own time of a system which came into existence, and whether it's going to be sustained itself is a question which nobody really knows. So I see that we have geographic systems, we have this whole Inter-Asia system. These were the things I can go and look at the ruins. And that's all that tells me what that system once was. So when I drive down the road there and I look at these, it's like I'm looking at echoes of something which was so vital and so meaningful. And then I look at these great remains of just bricks on top of bricks, rammed earth on top of rammed earth that still stands. The rest of it, the whole system is gone, and this is all that's left. And how does it speak to me? How can I hear the voices of that system? By looking at these ruins. And that's what we try to do when we do archaeological work. I always, of course, have to mention maritime. And I thought about the Buddhist ruins. Where are they? Where are the Buddhist ruins that we can track and look at? Because I believe that to study Buddhism, it is as important to study the ruins as to study what was not destroyed. And it's the ruins which tell us a great deal about the way in which Buddhism developed. So, for example, we can go to Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat, beautiful ruins. Ruins that have been, we think, in a system which was huge. It had to be a huge system. It had to be a lot of money to build all of this. And now I go and I see the banyan trees taking over. The tree roots are covering all of that carefully constructed material. But I finally found out that the roots are very compassionate. Without the roots, these things would already have crumbled. The roots have become the thing which holds up a lot of the structures of Angkor Wat. So when they decided when the big trees fall, it's very destructive. So they cut the big trees off, which is sad, you know, you just see stumps these days. But they had to leave the roots to hold it up. But here was a system. And then when it goes, I get this kind of, the forest comes back, the jungle takes over. How can I deal with that kind of system? I've lost a slide. I'll come back to it. In some cases, when one system replaces another, the new system simply takes over. It doesn't destroy. For example, the famous mosque in Turkey was a Christian cathedral. When the Christian tradition and system that built it disappeared, Islam became the dominant religion. Then they looked at this large structure and said to themselves, what do we do with it? Do we tear it down because it's not a Christian place? And somebody said, are you kidding? This is fantastic. You don't want to tear this beautiful building down, make it a mosque. And so one of the great mosques of Islam today is a past Christian cathedral. That's another way to deal with systemic change. The whole system of religion shifted. So instead of just destroying it, as we see from many systems that come in and destroy the previous system, they just said, hey, we'll make it ours. We will just convert it and transform it, and it will become a religious structure for our system. And nobody worries about the fact that it once belonged to another system. The Grand Canal. The Grand Canal of China was a fantastic system. We hardly have fully understood all of the canal systems. Some of you who were in my seminar, Alex Amos is doing a fantastic job of uncovering all the Buddhist sites in the Grand Canal. There were many, huge. But when you look at what's happening now, when they go back into where some of the canal has just filled up and become dirt, and they uncover it, they come across, like as in this case, a large sailing ship, not a sailing ship so much, but basically a tug that was built in the Ming Dynasty. The system of the canal filled up with dirt. Nobody was keeping it open. They had no water for this boat. It covered up. Now we go in, and our archaeology shows us once there was a system here. What was here were large vessels that were towed on water and carried the trade of China up and down. And that system, when it was replaced, then suddenly we can see it goes to ruins. But the system which produced this body of water that could have a vessel this size was incredible. It was one of the great architectural features of China, and it was one of the engineering feats that was hard to equal. Now, we've had it in this country. The Erie Canal in the East Coast in New York. Erie Canal was our Grand Canal. We had a Grand Canal in this country. The Erie Canal is what carried everything to the west, and from the west to the east. And for a while, the Erie Canal and all the canal systems that we had in this country were a system quite comparable to this. What happened? Why did it remain? And it's called the railroad train. The minute you had railroads, another system came into existence. Who's going to use the canal when all you have to do is lay some tracks and your train runs down those tracks and you don't have to scoop out all the mud every couple of years and you don't have all of that trouble to keep it maintained and you don't have to have things that up and take you up and down so that you can float. So another technological system comes in, and when it comes in, it replaces what was there. See, we're facing this in education today. A new system has come into existence, which is called the internet and the digital world. It's a new system. And we don't yet know quite what to do with it in education. What about our libraries and physical codex books? What about the ways in which we have always taught, face-to-face, or sometimes online as we are here? But if that system changes and a new system comes, you have to be aware of that, it seems to me, and be very sure that you try to figure out what comes with the new system and what's going to go into ruins because of the new system. It will change. The things that worked in the old system will not just of their own accord necessarily survive. So part of our educational system that we've had in the past will probably not survive this new system. The new system will put in things that we've never had before. So how can we prepare an education, or how can we deal with the fact that we're in the midst of one of the greatest systemic changes that the world has seen in a long time? It's not something that only happens back there in these ruins that I look at. The ruins remind me we're faced with it right now. We're faced with a systemic change, and we have to figure out what to do about it. So I go back and I look at a great place like Nalanda. Here, a great university monastery, a huge stupa to Shariputra, the main disciple of the Buddha. A university where you could walk down the street and you could study Yogacara or Savastivada or Madhyamika. They had a college for these. And now it's gone. All I have is the ruins. And so the system which supported Nalanda, what really was that system? Do I know who it was who built such a magnificent place? Do I know who could support so many hundreds of monks that lived there? It seems to be mainly monks who lived there. How did they support themselves? What was the system which supported them? And what was that system that collapsed? So I have to go back and try to reconstruct in history if I can. So I go back and I look at the Pala dynasty. Say to myself, aha, in the Pala dynasty, the government supported this place. Obviously, this was one of the great centers for the Buddhists. But when that government collapses, or when that dynasty ends, or when that kingdom comes to an end, that's a very major systemic change. And those systems are going to show themselves again as ruins. When I go to Malaysia, the same thing is true. Take a place like Sumatra. Sumatra once was a great Buddhist center. It was filled with great Buddhist buildings and monasteries, huge. It thrived on the system of maritime trade with Indian merchants. And when that system ended, then those places went into ruins. And what changed? What changed was the merchants the merchants who were functioning were Islamic, Nabatean Arabs. Everywhere that they took over the seaports, then Buddhism just disappeared because the system disappeared that supported them. In other words, that system was so crucial to Buddhism that if you just changed it, it seems like a minor change in a way, that the merchants who were really doing most of the trade, instead of being Indian Buddhist merchants, became Arab Islamic merchants, and the whole Buddhist tradition simply slipped into ruins. However, in Malaysia and in Sumatra, Buddhism is coming back. Another system has begun to operate. And this new system that's operating there is, can anybody tell me what it is? Chinese diaspora, the Chinese merchant. Now, instead of the Arab merchant, in many places in Sumatra, the merchants who are Malayan people who are doing trade are Chinese. And so what happens is we began to see Buddhist structures reappearing, brand new ones. So on the ruins of the old system that dates back to the Srivijaya kingdom, which have all now disappeared into ruins, we're watching Buddhism again arising with a new system of merchants, and we have big, beautiful pagodas being built today in a place which everybody says is Islamic. Systems then can change, and where it caused the decline, a new system comes in, but it's different. This system for Buddhism is not the old system for Buddhism. It's not that Buddhism has just awakened from its sleep again. It's new, because it always depends and is defined to some degree by the system that supports it. So we always have to ask ourselves the question, what system is functioning that causes this pagoda to be built? Why would they build this pagoda right here in a place that is dominantly Islamic? How did they have enough money to do that? How did they have enough people who were strong enough to resist the majority religious community to say, we get to have our own structure? So it can change. The changeability of it is something which I think, if we're talking about this, it's not just a one-way street. It's very easy to say, aha, you go with the system, once it fails, it's over, finished. There'll never be Buddhism again in these places. But if a new system comes in, it's a new story. If the system that comes in is supportive of Buddhism, Buddhism will arise again. It's systemic. I look at a place like Myanmar. You go to Pagan, a city of ruins in a Buddhist country. It's amazing when you think about it. You would think that in a place that has remained so strongly Buddhist, how in the world could they have Buddhist ruins? Not only some Buddhist ruins, but one of the most, incredibly numerous ruins of large Buddhist structures that the world knows. Hundreds of stupas that are huge structures which have become, for the most part, just allowing to slowly disintegrate. It's political in that sense, because I can move over to the capital and I find Buddhism being displayed in the most magnificent way possible. Shwedagowan rises with its golden spires above a city, not far from these ruined stupas. This one thrives. They are two different systems. Two different systems entirely. Pagan belongs to an older kingdom. That kingdom is gone. The kingdom that was the system that supported it is no longer there. Whereas in the current state, the Burmese kingdom, and the Burmese dominate in the capital city, they are able to construct something that's this magnificent. As long as that system is there and it's firmly in place, there is no reason to worry about Shwetagawan. It thrives. The system is fully supportive. It's fully in place. It's still there. So it's not always that we have, if we try to study just by country and say, oh, well, the ruins of Buddhism are only in countries that have stopped being Buddhist. The ruins of Buddhism can be in a country which is dominantly Buddhist, but the ruins represent this older kingdom or an older system which is no longer functioning. Whereas the Buddhist system of today, when it's fully functional, can produce this fantastic result. So we still are dealing with systems. If we go to Java, the world's largest Buddhist structure, we think, Borobudur, was a ruin. It's been reconstructed. The Dutch worked very hard to reconstruct it. But it basically was a ruin, and it basically is just a reconstructed ruin. There is no real, true Buddhist major community to support this. People come as pilgrims, so there's a big pilgrimage, but the local people of that region are Islamic. The government that helped to reconstruct it was colonial and Islamic. Was done because it belongs now to a new system, which is tourism. Tourism is a big thing. Colonialism was a big system. The colonials wanted to say from Holland, look, we can take your old culture and reconstruct it. We're not going to let your old ruins happen. We're really here for good purposes. You should support us because we're building back your own cultural system. But when we're there, we have a strange thing, and that is that next door, at the same period as Borobudur, it's all Brahmanic. The spires that we see in the next picture are Brahmanic, they are not Buddhist. So how in the world could you have two systems side by side? The Buddhists and the Brahmins side by side at the same time building large structures. Was it that there were two very discrete communities of believers? One group was Brahmanic and one was Buddhist, and each one tried to outdo the other, and the competition produced these great structures. It seems that that's probably not so. That it was the same people who went to both. In other words, it was a system that we are not yet fully studying the way we should. That Buddhism and Brahmanism were not so carefully divided into two really very separate systems in India. And they still are not in Thailand. And they were not at Borobudur and its neighboring Brahmanic structures. That people, the system allowed you to do both. So that if we don't understand Brahmanic Buddhism, I think we don't understand the history. So the structures tell us There have been systems in which the two existed side by side and intertwined with each other, and nobody was worried about it. And nobody said, tisk, tisk, what are you doing over there on the Brahmanic side? You're a Buddhist, you should only be over here. And what are you, a Brahmin, doing over here on the Buddhist side? You should go back over there. No such system probably ever existed. People were not so concerned about that. They were not so structured as we are today. So, I look at Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur is one of the great Islamic cities, if you will, in one sense. Their mosque and some of their structures for Islam are unexcelled. But you have incredible Hindu temples and Buddhist monasteries in the same city. In other words, when we take as a nation and we say, we say Malaysia is Islamic, and there are many people in the Malaysian government who would like to say so, and they do. And they say, we're never going to study in our history anything before the 15th century because it was this age of darkness. So we don't teach our children about that. We just teach them about when Islam came to Malaysia. But at the same time that politicians say this, and it's popular, when we look at the structures of what's there, we can say, this is a system. I see a Hindu system, I see a Buddhist system, I see an Islamic system, and somehow they're all intertwining and functioning as a single city in a single country. So systems become really complex, and you don't just have one at a time. I think that's one of the problems that we have in our histories. We tend to look and say, aha, that was the system. When the system fails, then another system comes, and that becomes the system of the time. But I don't think that history really supports that. So when we look back in Europe, we can see, for example, the Roman Empire, a whole system, huge, huge system. We can go to Syria, and there we see Christianity in the ruins. Each of these was a system. And in order to understand what creates these great ruins is not just Buddhism, but Christianity has its ruins. The Roman Empire had its ruins. Go to Egypt, what do you see? You see the pyramids and the Sphinx. What are they? They are the ruins of the pharaohic system that no longer exists. Nobody is a pharaohic follower anymore. But their system produced those things, and we look at the ruins and marvel at how big they are. And wow, what a system it was that could create this incredible thing that I'm looking at. Today, we can follow many different kinds of systems for Christianity. For example, you can go to North Korea and you can find a church. You can find a big church building. It's not that anybody much goes there, mind you. It's not that it's really used as in the current system, but it's maintained, and it's a tourist place, and you take people to see it. If you go to the south in Korea, then Christianity as a system is enormous. It's perhaps a quarter of the population. And they have mega churches. And the first mega church in the world was probably the church is shown here in South Korea, Seoul, where they have 40,000 people on a Sunday come, like a sports event almost. Huge crowds of people. That's a system. What is the difference between these two things? One, this kind of silent, quiet remains of almost a ruined system of Christian missionary activity in North Korea, where nobody much goes, one or two might show up on a day. Or when I go south of the border, 27 miles to the south of the border, I find a mega church. Very different systems. And I'm trying to understand Korea is to try to understand which system functions to produce these two quite different approaches to a religious tradition. Paris, the church Madeleine. Beautiful place. I love to go there. But I don't go there for a religious ceremony. I go there to concerts. It's really a ruin, which has been appropriated for music. It's been made into a public building for music and drama. It's become a theater. It's just been appropriated for a different thing. Nobody thinks of it as that's the place where you would find throngs of people that once went there, that filled it undoubtedly in the early days when they built it. Huge structure, holds 1,000 people at least. Now, the only time that you really see it open is 7 at night when there's a concert, and then it fills up. Paris, think of it as belonging to a system, but then you look at Thich Nhat Hanh, you look at the large flocks of Buddhists who follow him in Paris. It's hard for me to believe it, but one of the Parisian newspapers reported more people practice Buddhism than go to Mass. Be true, because so few people are going to Mass anymore. When great churches become theaters, the system is shifting. And what is the system that supports someone like Thich Nhat Hanh and his community? It is another system, which is immigration. And the immigration itself is a system. And some of you in the room are part of a system. You understand that the immigration groups become a system, and they have their own power and systemic usefulness, so that we're seeing different systems functioning in the same place. I like this picture in Russia. Of all the people that you would put, this is Putin. Think of what happened to the Kalmykian people under the USSR. And under the Tsar. They were persecuted, they were forcefully repositioned and changed. They suffered much from that system. Now the government system has shifted, and so in order to be popular, then the president of Russia goes and stands together with the Kalmykian monks and nuns to be photographed. Politicians are often very clever to see what a system is and what will work for them. So if you ask a politician, in one sense, to just belong to one system, they will probably laugh at you, because they'll say, hey, we understand that out here in this vast group of people, which we need to vote for us, there are a number of very discrete systems operating. And if we don't understand what those systems are and speak to those systems, we probably will never get elected. We have to be systemic about it. So sometimes you say, well, you change your message. You say one thing over here, you say another thing over here. Well, of course, because they're speaking to two different systems. And that's part of what politics has always been to some degree, speaking to systems. Here in Los Angeles, the Crystal Cathedral went bankrupt. The system which supported it failed. So what do you do with this famous building? You sell it to the Catholics. Didn't want to do it because it was built by Protestants. Protestants said, oh no, we've failed. Our system that supported and built this incredible building can't sustain it anymore. So now it has become Christ Cathedral. Its name has been changed. It is now a Catholic cathedral. Two systems operating. One that failed could no longer support it. So you can either sell it or tear it down or have somebody else tear it down. But in this case, it's like the mosque in Turkey. You don't tear it down. You just transform it into something which represents your system. And after a while, people forget that it's even was ever anything other than the Catholic cathedral. When I look at the Protestant churches around, particularly in the great cities, the number of Protestant churches that survive because they have Korean congregations that make use of their buildings. Because many of these mainline Protestant churches, the system that supported them has begun to fail. They don't have the membership they once had. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopals, they don't have it. And so in order to maintain their system, they have to import another system, which is Korean Christianity, which is still very active and very lively. And so the Koreans take their services into them. They don't have to build a building, which is good for them. And they support the building enough so that the few people who remain from the old system can still joyously say, well, we still have our church, we still go there, our system is still in place, even though we can't afford it, and without the Koreans, we would long since have lost it. When I look at mega churches in the United States, we have them just like in Korea, and you have them here in Southern California, and Texas, and other places, huge, huge mega churches. That's a whole system. Each mega church is its own system. And they are, I think, have the difficulty that for the most part, they are built on the charisma of a single person. And mega churches or systems that are built on the charisma of a single person are always in danger when that person falls out of favor or passes away or gets sick or whatever happens. So that mega churches have this problem, and some of them have failed. They can't sustain it into the next generation or generation after generation. In London, if you go to the Fo Guang Shan group in London, you go to what was once a Christian church. When the Buddhists wanted to establish a center in London, which is very hard, there's no place to build it. You can't tear anything down because it's all historic. In this case, you simply buy the church, and the system which supported this church could no longer support it. Nobody was going to church. It was just simply emptying, and it was running down. And so the powers that be said it's better to close it, to sell it, than to let it go into decay. The Buddhists buy it. The Buddhists make it theirs. It's like the mosque. You see two systems come along. If one can't sustain it and another can, they will just appropriate. And a new system takes place of the old. In Australia and New Zealand, they are in a rather unique situation. They're like the US. They don't have an ancient history except for their Aboriginals. And the Aboriginals didn't build structures. So they don't have structural archaeology even. So what happens there with a new system that comes in, you have to do similar almost to what's happened, say, in Los Angeles. You just build something that's completely new. Nothing was there before. You are the beginning of a system that had no predecessor. So you see in the picture here, Nanjing Institute, our sister campus, their new building. Fantastic building, by the way. I love it. It's beautifully done. There was nothing there. It wasn't that there was a system which they replaced. There was nothing there. It was empty land, had been empty forever. And so a new system comes in and builds completely anew. That's hard to do. That is very hard to do. So what is the system that sustains in New Zealand and Australia? It again is what we see in Sumatra. The Taiwanese diaspora. That is the Taiwanese immigration and business interests that have gone there as they have come here to the US. That system is the one which now introduces a whole new thing that nobody has ever seen before in those places, brand new. And then last, I'd like to, I don't know how many of you know the history of this place. It was built and originally was called the Rosemead Institute of Psychology. It was a Christian group that was a single family, the Naramores. Naramore was a psychologist. He was very famous. He wrote a lot of books. He was a very devout Christian. And he raised enough money to buy this piece of property and to build these buildings. The buildings which we still have at the University of the West were already constructed by Dr. Naramore. They are his constructions. If you look at them, you will see names like the Dorme. You will see names of people up there. When U West was purchased by Foguanshan, Master Xingyun said, leave those names on there because those people paid the building and they deserve to be recognized. Do not take their names off. We recognize them even. The irony, in one sense to me, as I look at what's happened here, is the Naramore and the Rosemead Institute of Psychology went bankrupt. And it was primarily, I understand, a kind of battle within the family, the Naramore family. caused the bankruptcy. Then the question was what to do with this all these structures. What would happen to this place? When Foganshan approached them, it was like rubbing the worst kind of salt in the wound. Because this place had one of its main functions was to work with Christian missionaries, many who went to Asia, and it also did the purpose of working with the children of missionaries who had been raised abroad, and when they had to come to the U.S. to go to college, they had never been in the U.S., many of them. They had been missionary children in far-flung places in the world. And the cultural shock which they faced was horrendous for them. And many of them could not function coming into the U.S. because they had been brought up in a small little village somewhere in Africa or Asia, and that was their life. And suddenly they find themselves having to confront the whole culture of the U.S. They couldn't do it. So Dr. Naramore was very compassionate. He said, we have to help these young people. And so this place was the place for re-entry, where the missionary children came here to get reacquainted with their own culture. Well, today this place has changed. When Foganshan approached the Naramore family, they said, we just can't sell it to Buddhists. And we won't. So investors had to buy it from them, and Foganshan then turned around and purchased it from the investors. It was just a kind of facade. They knew what was happening, but it saved face to some degree. Think of what has happened to this place. Instead of sending out missionaries around the world to spread a religious tradition from this country, this has been a place of ingestion. Many of you have come here from those places. You are not returned missionary children. You are immigrants. And this place has become the opposite in a way. It is a place of a new system. It's a system of Buddhism. It is a system of helping people who are Buddhist leaders to deal with and function in this culture in some ways. Many of you I think, use this university to adapt and find out how to think and know the history and the issues that are presented by a new culture. So even as we sit here, we are in a place that has gone through a major systemic shift. We are part of that kind of shifting, where one system fails, cannot maintain itself. Another system comes along and appropriates the structure and the whole system and changes it, of course, dramatically. And that's often the case. It is not so much, as I look at it, I can find very few examples where a system is replaced by another system that's quite similar. That does not seem to happen. The system is replaced by something which is almost its opposite. Like Christian missionaries and Buddhist missionaries almost. How could you have such a great shift? So what I've been saying tonight is, it's really important to think about what supports and maintains a system. And all of us in the world today are going to face the fact that the systems which we have today will not be the systems that we may have 10 years from now, or 15 years, or 20 years. Certainly that will be true for me, but I'm going to make the big system shift. But you who are younger, this is what life is going to be like, because the systemic shifts are becoming faster, becoming more dramatic, and as they shift and change, it is very difficult to figure out how to maintain ourselves in such a way as to be able to deal and live with this new systemic shift that occurs. But I believe that if we are aware of these systems, that we can make some judicious decisions. There are times when a system is finished. There's no way that you can try to hold on to it. It's like Inner Asia. There was no way to hold on to all those cities. There was no support for it. There was no system to support all that. Like it or not, they were going to go to the Loons. It was inevitable, just inevitable. And in Turkey, it was, how could you possibly have a giant Christian cathedral with no people to go to it or support it? It was inevitable. It either had to just go to ruins or be appropriated. So I think it behooves everybody to think carefully about what is the system that supports you? What is your system? Do you understand your system? Do we understand what systems are functioning in our societies? Very important to do that. Once we know what our systems are, then I think we are able to be more creative. I think we can be more helpful. I think we can deal with the shifts and changes that are inevitable, because we understand that we're dealing with a dynamic, shifting, systemic environment. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about the future of Buddhism. In one sense, it's an extension of tonight's lecture. It is the question of what are any hints as to what are the systems of the future? What are they going to be like? And how can we figure out how to adapt, adjust in such a way that the systemic changes don't destroy, but that we learn how to make the systemic shifts and changes nurturing. Thank you very much.